just to give you a perspective, right? So let's say if I'm trying to do something in potatoes, so potatoes in the north grows once a year. So it grows in the typically sowing happens in the October cycle, and then the harvesting starts around January through March. So that's like once a year. So if you miss anything, then the next cycle is the following year, right? It's unlike software where you can get releases out like every week. So you have to be mindful of that it's a different ball game. It does require patience, but the good part is that I think the impact can be very huge because there is not a lot that has been done. So that is the plus side, but be patient.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Every week, I speak to founders, operators, and investors in the Indian startup ecosystem to understand what it takes to build and scale the next unicorn. If you haven't done so already, please follow or subscribe to the Startup Operator and rate and review us on your favorite platforms. This week, we have Varun Khurana, who's a three-time entrepreneur and former CTO of Grofers, on the podcast. Varun is now the co-founder of Crofarms, or OTP, which is their consumer service that some of you may be familiar with in NCR. Varun is striving to make fresh produce demand driven. And to that end, he's working with farmers to optimize the very complex supply chain ecosystem with predictive algorithms and whatnot. In this conversation, Varun speaks about his transition from a techie to an agripreneur, what inspired that, what he's learned while working in the space, and really what it takes to build a successful agribusiness. This is a podcast with a lot of wisdom. I'm sure you'll like it. So let's get started on this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Varun Khurana. Hey, Varun, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you for having me. Look forward to our interaction today.
Yeah, this is going to be a fascinating chat, I'm sure, right? We've had a couple of agri entrepreneurs earlier, and those are some of the more interesting conversations that I've had because it's a sector and domain that I think not a lot of people are aware of, right? I want to talk to you about your transition. You've been a techie for most of your life, right? And somewhere you transitioned into being an agri entrepreneur. Those are two different worlds, it seems like, right? I mean, because tech is a lot more deterministic world, right? It's ones and zeros, whereas agri seems to be a very probabilistic world, right? I mean, you're dependent on the vagaries of mother nature and so on. So
Correct.
how did this shift happen, and what did you learn? How are you adjusting to this new space?
Sure, absolutely. So you're right. I have had a very, this huge, the transition is pretty massive if you look at it, because I graduated from IIT Delhi in computer science, which is like, hardcore tech. And then the job that I took up was in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. So that again is like, the mecca of all technology, right? And then after spending 5 years in the US, I moved back to India. I've been a serial entrepreneur since. Now, I would say the reason for going into agri, so one was that right before I started my current company, Crofarm, and OTP is the name of the fruits and vegetable service that we offer to consumers. So right before starting this, I was the chief technology officer at Grofers, which is now Blinkit, which is into quick commerce. And one of the things that has been existent, while I was there, and also from what I hear now, is that fresh was I would say, a very small contributor to the business. So it was a 2% contributor to the business and a 20% contributor to the complaints. So that was one thing which was obviously exciting, that this is an interesting problem to solve. So that was one. Secondly, actually two other reasons. So one is that what I've seen is that in life, when the biggest innovations happen, Roshan, when two completely different disciplines, they kind of come together. So you see a lot of, I would say, wonders come out, right? And I think in those days in agri, there were talks happening around about how IoT is impacting soil quality and how you can measure and so on. So actually agri has a lot of things to it. So this was one thing that I felt. And third thing was that, see, I have done two startups before this and exited them successfully. The last one I exited to Grofers, and that is how I was the CTO there. And I really wanted to do something which has enough, I would say, huge horizons available for me. I didn't want key, video quick thing, done and it's over. I was really like, something, if I could do it for a decade, 2 decades, I don't have, but it should be a, a meaningful problem to solve. So broadly I would say these are the three reasons that enticed me into venturing into agri or agri tech.
Right. And you've been in the space for a while, right? I mean, I think since 2014, 2015, you've been involved in that space in some form or fashion. How have you seen that, space evolve, right? I mean, in the last 8 to 10 years? And also, what are those adjustments that you've had to make, simply from a mindset perspective? Because I'm sure that, both these worlds are very disparate, right?
So see, I started Crofarm in 2016. We are in 2022 right now. So it has been 6 years. I think back then, at least if I talk about the venture world, investment in agri was not happening as much. Broadly checks to the tune of 2 million ballparks is what I think I had heard at the time. So it was not, as talked about. The number of startups were also fewer and the number of investors were also fewer. And, I think both are correlated, because if you think about it, typically you'll find, entrepreneurship also, I would say, aligns itself with areas where more capital is available. That happens. That is something that, if you see history, you'll see history talk about it like every now and then. Like, I've even heard that during the days of Vasco da Gama, there was capital that was available for exploring other lands. And that is why there were a lot of, I would say, exploratory, ship adventures that would happen. So this is history, and I think so. So that is one reason. So now I think the capital available is much more. There are investments that are going into it, and I would say both in India and in the US. So I think that is one thing that has changed, and correspondingly the number of startups also has increased significantly. So overall, I think it's in a very good position right now. I would say the best, at least in the last couple of years, that I have seen.
Right. When you look at the space, right, as an outsider, I mean, you see a plethora of problems and also classic problems that tech can solve, right? Like things like, fragmentation, information asymmetry, and so on and so forth. But then, I mean, how did you pick on the idea that you want to solve, right? How did it speak to you? And how did that whole idea to product to company happen?
So you're right. See, if you look at agri, you'll find actually there are wonderful, wonderful problems all over the place that are there to solve. So people have been talking about solving for inputs, which is seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, which is stuff that goes into growing a crop. Then while you're growing, people have been doing. There have been startups around farm equipment sharing, because a lot of stuff happens manual. So if you can time share some of these things and it is can be lower cost than labor, then it is worthwhile. Then there is financing opportunities, because from a farmer standpoint, when you are sowing a crop, that is when you need a bulk of your or that is when you incur a bulk of your cost. You will all the sowing, the labor, the seeds, including fertilizers, etc. And you get the value of that crop once it has grown and the harvesting has happened, which can easily be 2 months, 3 months. These are easy cycles, especially in the fruits and vegetables category. So and then the last thing is the output problem for a farmer. Once I've grown, where do I sell, what value will I get, and so on. So what I realized, Roshan, was that I think output is the mother of all problems. The reason is that, see, if you talk about inputs, mechanizations, all the services, advisory that you give to a farmer, ultimately, see, however much he earns will determine how much he can spend. So if you address that piece of it, then a lot of the other things can follow. You can, because if you're guaranteeing him, I would say, revenue for his crop, then a lot of other things you can actually get a farmer to do for you. So that was my thesis, Roshan, where I felt that output is the mother of all problems, and that is worth focusing on, and that is what we decided to focus on.
So, Varun, let's talk about Crowfarm then, right? Describe Crowfarm to our listeners and talk about some of the common use cases that you're solving.
See, Crofarm Agri Products Private Limited is the name of the mother entity, and we run a service called OTP, which is OTIPY. Broadly, the theory is behind the business is this, that when you're dealing with perishables degrade very quickly. That's the nature of the commodity. So, ideally, from the harvest time till the time that you hand it to your consumer, you want the time elapsed should be as little as possible, because that is what will ensure that your consumer gets the best quality. The other good part about this is that if you're able to optimize for that time, you are also able to reduce your wastage significantly. Because see, wastage happens when there is produce that is stocked. So a simple example, right? So if you have, four or five apples, you stock them in your refrigerator for a week. If you open it after a week, you'll see that one or two apples would have developed, browning and spots and so on. Now, as a consumer, though, you might still cut that and eat it. But if I'm a business guy and I'm supposed to sell it, I won't be able to sell those one or two pieces. Now, this is in the case of a refrigerator where it is a cold environment. Now, if we do the same thing in ambient temperatures, you'll see that the same effect will happen in 3 days. And this is because apple is a sturdy commodity. If I apply the same concept to, let's say, lettuce or spinach, then you will see the same effect happening in one day. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you're able to move it quickly and you don't stock, so then that saves your wastages also. And if you're able to save on those wastages, you can actually not only give the consumers better quality, but at a cheaper price also. So if you think about it, it kind of seems very counterintuitive, because normally people pay more for better quality. Here you can actually make it the other way around. You can say, look, I'll give you better quality and at a lower price. So broadly, the thesis around this is this only, Roshan, that design a supply chain which is designed for speed, so that once it is harvested, it moves very quickly all the way to the consumer. And with that, you can give consumers better quality at a better price. And in our case, we are able to move produce in as little as 12 hours from farm to fork. And this is enabled through a supply chain which works on prediction, and we leverage AI to a good degree there, where we would keep track of things like, let's say, the weather, right? So if it is rainy, you'll see that on that particular day, the sale of, let's say, watermelon in summers, or if I talk about nariyal pani, that will go down, because if it's rainy, you don't feel like drinking or eating watermelon as much. So these factors also impact demands. Festivities impact demand. So you'll see that during Navratris, the sale of onions goes down, the sales of potato, bananas, etc. goes up. So this fast supply chain is achieved through a prediction. Second is through our warehouse, which has been customly designed for moving produce quickly. It works like an assembly line, and it does quality check. We do packing. So when I say packing, think of it like from the farm, I get a ton worth of produce and I pack it into 1 kg units. And then picking, which is basically like, if your order has 1 kg of potatoes, half a kg of spinach, and let's say 1 kg of apple, so that is the picking process and picking your order. And then last is dispatch. This is the second leg of it. And the third leg is what we call a community leader model, where at the last mile we have a small businessman or a lady, as could be a male or a female. And these are small businessmen who work 1 or 2 hours early in the morning and perform the last mile logistics. So this is the supply chain and what it takes to basically deliver in the 12-hour time frame. And the delivery happens in the morning. And last but not the least is that along the way we have been able to optimize on wastages to a very big degree. So while conventional supply chain sees 35-40%, we see 3 to 4%. And that saving in wastage is something that you pass some of that to the consumer. You help the farmer a little bit by paying him a little bit more, and you keep a little bit for yourself. So broadly, that is how the model works.
Yeah, this is super fascinating. Making produce very demand driven, right? I mean, kind of like just in time in some sense. I mean, that's a very complex problem to solve, right? I mean, there's so many variables involved, and you mentioned some of these cycles, go into months. So I'm just curious. I mean, how are you able to complete the loop and optimize it in a way like you mentioned, right? I mean, 12 to 14 hours, and so on. So what goes into all of these things, right? I mean, how do you get the math right in terms of sourcing and production optimization, delivery, all of those things?
Yeah, it is not an easy problem, because if I talk about NCR, so we move about 110 tons of fresh produce every day, which goes to about anywhere from 18 to 20,000 households every day. And we have about 80 to 100 trucks that come in every day, and then another 150 odd trucks that go out every day. And then we have about, I would say, 600 to 800 odd community leaders who the bags are handed over to, consumer bags, and they would in turn hand it to, I would say, around 25 to 30 odd consumers that each community leader serves. So that is, I would say, the you'll get a sense of the intensity that and then all the variables, right? Because the things that happen is, let's say, कहीं जाम हो गया, right? You'll see that your truck gets stuck. You run into situations where it is raining on a particular day at the farm. So how does harvesting happen? And then we have approximately, so we have two warehouses in NCR, and we have one in Mumbai. Mumbai we have recently started, and at each warehouse approximately 200 staff that comes in every day, and it's a 24-hour operation. The only 2 days that in the year that we don't deliver, one is the day after Diwali, so that was like 2 days back, and one is the day of Holi. Other than that, the balance 363 days in a regular year and 364 days in a leap year, our operations are on 24/7. So it is a very intense operations. There is a lot that goes into coordinating with the farmers, agreeing with them the price on a daily basis, planning the quantity of produce that we will procure ahead of the season, where before a season starts we might say ki, we expect to be procuring, let's say, 4 tons or 5 tons of cauliflower every day, and then splitting the load amongst 2 or 3 farmers. So there's planning that happens ahead of the season. There is day to day pricing discussions that happen with the farmers. Then, like I said, at the warehouse there is a lot of technology that is at play, which is involved in the packing, picking process, so that there are no errors. The whole thing is completely traceable, where as a consumer, when you get the product, it is QR coded, and in case there is a problem and you complain, because it goes scanned, so we can immediately trace it back to the farmer, and that brings a lot of responsibility. So as a farmer, I know that if I don't do a good job, I will get caught eventually, and which is why I would not want to provide produce which is substandard by any means. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of coordination with the farmers at the back end, there's a lot of coordination with the community leaders at the front, and they in turn do the last mile with the consumer. So I would say there's a lot of hard work that goes into it. It's a 24/7 business, but it's a recession proof business as well. So that's the good part. And there is a huge role that technology plays in making all of this kind of work together, including the predictions and apps on which the consumers order, and even the communication with the farmer at the back end is done through technology. So a lot of stuff goes into making all of this work.
Right. So how do you scale regions and cities and so on, right? I mean, because it's very, very ops intensive, as we learned. And it's also, again, very different from the previous world that you were in, where you're scaling bits and bytes versus here. I mean, it's actual physical stuff, right? So what goes into opening up a newer region? If you can walk us through your day zero and, what goes into it.
See, broadly, there are two aspects to it. One is the supply, and the other is the demand. So, on the supply side, you first have to make sure that your supply sources are identified. And broadly, the way it works, Roshan, is that in India, Typically, if you go to any metro, like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, what have you, so a lot of the, I would say at least 50% of the fresh produce that we consume is grown locally, so it's not too far off. And there are, I would say, there are belts which are vegetable growing belts that you identify, and then you go out there and you scout for farmers. So that is how it works. And broadly, you'll find like a cluster there. It could be a farmer producer organization, it could be let's say a farmer that has maybe hectare, 2 hectares, 4 hectares, so typically to that range. But usually, even if you are able to identify one farmer, the farmers are typically very well connected in their village or in that area, and they know ki who is growing what. So if you have identified one, then broadly you have a good access to the crop set that's growing in that region, which could be anywhere from 10 to 20 crops odd. So first step is identifying the growing region and the farmer base that's going to supply. The second part of it is getting the community leaders. For that, there is, I would say, some level of feet on street that we deploy. There is some level of digital that we also use, and we would onboard them. Now, with that kind of fitting in place, the rest is just getting a warehouse and deploying the technology and tying in the pieces together. But broadly, you can expect that when you start any city, I would say a month to anywhere from a month to 2 months time frame is what you have to budget for in terms of identifying the community leader set, the farmer set, and then once you launch, you basically entice the community leaders to spreading the word in their community, and then the consumer orders start to kick in.
What is it like working with farmers? I understand a lot of corporates and startups are now starting to woo these folks. What are some of the things that you've experienced with these for working with these folks?
See, I would say there are quite a few things that are worth talking about. So one is that, see, a lot of these farmers, there is, it takes a while to develop that trust. See, that is one thing that is there. And see, this is a what, a centuries old industry, right? Agriculture, and people have been doing it for generations. So there is a lot of baggage also. You have to be mindful of that with the farmers. So first thing is trust. That is step number one. And having a face or someone who's of that area who's known, that helps for sure. So that is one. Second thing is that, see, what we have seen is that typically it's very hard to bind farmers with contracts. So we don't do a lot of contracts. Most of the discussion is verbal. And broadly the business starts, and then as day to day produce moves, they get electronic notifications on their phone that this is the value of goods that you sent yesterday, and this is the total amount that the company owes you, and basis the payment terms, this is when the amount will hit your account. So that communication is digital. But it's very hard to, I would say, get farmers to abide or honor contract. So we don't do a lot of that. These are conversations, mostly it is verbal. But the good part is that once the flow starts, so like we have farmers who have been working with us for now like 4 years, 5 years, as long as that. So these are some of the insights that at least we have had working with farmers. The third thing is that I think within a village the farmer community is very closely knit also. So once you start, you typically, the word spreads very quickly. So that is a third thing.
So you serve a couple of other personas as well, right? Consumers, of course, and also businesses. Businesses, as in establishments like restaurants and so on. I would assume, right? So, what is the value proposition to these folks, and also how are you able to align the incentives and the structure in such a way that it is beneficial for all of these three entities?
So, Roshan, we see the first 4 years of the company were primarily B2B. The last 2 years have mostly been B2, B2C with Otipy. And actually, there is our B2B business is very negligible now. We don't do much of it. We have been focusing exclusively on consumer only. So, yeah, that is the nature of the business as of now. Pretty much all of it is consumer. There's not much B2B that we do today.
And how are you growing on the consumer side?
Oh, the growth is very nice. So, we on an average we see consumers after I would say the first few weeks, once they latch on, then once that flow starts, we typically hardly see any drop off. Average frequency with us is about 2 orders a week for vegetables. So that stickiness is there, and like I said, in NCR, amongst all the fruits and vegetables players online, we are already the biggest, and we have hardly done any marketing so far. So as we get into that, I think we will see a even bigger uptake. Like in Delhi NCR, so far I would say we have only gotten about 5 lakh households to transact, which is nothing. So there is so much more that is available. So growth has been very nice, and I think the next thing for us would be to challenge the offline establishments like Mother Dairy, Safal. They're the biggest amongst the offline players. They move anywhere from 160 to 180 tons a day. So I think over the next 6 to 9 months, hopefully, will be the biggest amongst all the organized players in NCR, online or offline.
Awesome. How does hiring work here? Because it's a sort of a new industry-ish, newish, I would say, right? I mean, when you talk about agri-tech as such, and there are not a lot of transferable skills. Like, let's say, I mean, you're working in fintech, and then tomorrow you move to health tech or something like that, right? So how do you look for candidates who could be a good fit for you?
See, on the hiring sides, if I specifically talk about on the agri side, so from a sourcing standpoint, we typically try to find people who are of that area. So, for example, Roshan, let's say, if you want to, we have a daily demand of about 7 to 9 tons of onion. That's our daily demand. So, onion is a commodity that is largely grown in Nasik in Maharashtra. So, when we would hire someone for that particular commodity, we would hire someone who is based out of Nasik and has, knows a lot of farmers who are in the area, and has, at least has some level of experience in procuring from them and selling it anywhere. That's fine. So I would say broadly on the agri-tech side, that is what we do. So basis the commodity that we are looking for experts on, so we would identify the best source and hire someone there. So that is the strategy on the back end side. The rest of it is standard problems with other startups face, like ops problems or marketing or tech people or product people. So those are challenges which are are omnipresent, and will be there.
There was a lot of brouhaha about these farm laws and regulation and so on, right? And I think it's high time that there is some kind of a reform in the agri sector particularly. I mean, we often hear the stat, right? I mean, 40-50% of the population is engaged in agriculture, but the yield and the produce and the income is so low comparatively. And basic things like market access, all of these things have to be solved, right? As someone who works in the sector, what are some 2 or 3 things that you would expect from policymakers and from government to do in the next 5-10 years to really transform the sector?
See, I think the initiatives that the government took were pretty aligned, in the sense that they talked about how farmers can directly sell, and there'll be no APMC fee that will be applicable, and so on and so forth. So I think the intentions of the government were, I would say, were very progressive. However, having said that, I think from the perspective of farmers, the bigger challenge that, or the roadblock that happened, was not so much fruits and vegetables, but I would say dry agri commodities like wheat, rice, which have a MSP, minimum selling price, so that the government has to offer. And I think that is a big source of income for a lot of farmers, who grow that, and it kind of gives like a guarantee. So this is unlike fruits and vegetables, where the price can be fluctuating, and as a farmer, you don't know how much you will make, and the amount can vary. But if you grow, let's say, wheat, etc., then MSP allows you to at least have a deterministic income. So I think these were, I would say, there was a small fraction of farmers which pushed the government into, I would say, taking a step back with respect to those laws. But I think the government initiatives along that direction are pretty progressive. Allowing, or I would say encouraging, private entities to procure directly. I think that is a good initiative. I think, in terms of other things, the government also has a lot of subsidies that are available when you make agri infrastructure, like, if you establish pack houses, etc. However, having said that, there is a lot of such subsidies that are available to, I would say, farmers. But I think the government can also make these available to enterprises or companies like us very easily. And eventually we would also serve the same objective, which is help facilitate farmers to grow that and then make sure that there is a market for it. So I think these are some of the things that the government can do in terms of making sure that these subsidies are available to startups like us also, rather than just making it available to farmers or farmer producer organizations.
Right. For someone who's listening to this podcast who maybe wants to start up in agriculture, right? I mean, what are some two or three things that they should remember? What would you say are lessons that you've learned that will stand them in good stead?
Yeah, I think, see, agri is a great sector. There is tons to do. Do bear in mind that it does require some patience. So, just to give you a perspective, right? So, let's say if I'm trying to do something in potatoes. So, potatoes in the north grows once a year. So, it grows in the typically sowing happens in the October cycle, and then the harvesting starts around January through March. So, that's like, once a year. So, if you miss anything, then the next cycle is the following year, right? It's unlike software where you can get releases out like every week.
Fail fast and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. So you have to be mindful of that it's a different ball game. Be mindful of that. So it does require patience, it does require time. So I think that is one thing that I'd like to tell anyone who's trying to do something in the agri space. But the good part is that I think the impact can be very huge because there is not a lot that has been done. So that is the plus side, but be patient.
Right. Wonderful. A lot of fascinating insights from this conversation. Before we end the podcast, any books or podcasts or, resources that you would recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I read all the startup stuff that I think any entrepreneur would read, honestly speaking. In terms of your podcast, there is a lot of material that some of the investors keep posting as well, so that is there. In terms of books, I think there are plenty. There's a book called 0 to 1. I think that's a good book worth reading. Once your company matures a bit, I think there's books around, I think Jim Collins' book, which is Good to Great, and then there is another one, Built to Last. These are very good books. So at a certain scale they become more applicable, but I think they are good. And then there's another book which I also read, which is The Innovator's Dilemma, which is about how certain technologies start to become commercially relevant once they cross a certain threshold. So I would say a lot of these books, it's not something that is unknown, but these are good ones. And then I think reading biographies is also pretty interesting. So reading about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and so on, I think these are also pretty interesting. So that is what I have read, and they've inspired me to a good degree, I would say.
Awesome. Hey, Varun, thank you again for making the time for this. I really loved this conversation and something that, I will go back to many times over to sort of reflect on some of the wisdom that you shared with us. Thank you and wish you all the very best for everything that you have coming up in the future.
Thank you, Roshan, and I enjoyed our conversation too. And thank you very much for inviting me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform. Also, get updates delivered straight to your WhatsApp inbox by clicking on the link in the description.